Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. A question many Idahoans may have on their minds, particularly when the legislature is in session, is who is actually representing my values? Now, if you're a particular special interest, you have a lot of lobbyists out there representing your values. But what if you are just an average citizen, a taxpayer, a person who wants to live life and pursue happiness according to your own understanding? Well, you might be surprised to find out who represents or who doesn't represent your interests, but there's a tool that's available. You could pick it up and start using it today. I'm going to tell you all about it in just a few moments.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and today I'm going to talk with you about the Idaho Freedom Index. You've heard me mention this before, but we're going to get into some specifics about how the Idaho Freedom Index works, what it's actually doing to make sure that it's your interests that are being represented and not just the special interests who come in with big money and lots of lobbyists to try to help shape public policy. To do this, I'm going to lean on two people who are very intimately acquainted with this. We'll start with the Idaho Freedom Foundation president, Ron Nate, who wrote about the Idaho Freedom Index just last week and talked about how it does its job. Now, you can see this for yourself, but I want you to hear his explanation and then go test it out for yourself and see if this rings true. He starts with the understanding that this year, the Idaho Freedom Foundation team analyzed and rated 444 bills, including 351 policy bills and 93 budget bills. I mean, that's a lot to track and a lot to keep track of and to evaluate. All the legislators' floor votes on those bills determined what their scores are under the Idaho Freedom Index and grades for the Freedom and Spending Indexes. Now, he says, note that all bill ratings are written and published prior to the legislators voting on the bills. You understand? It's impossible for legislator scores and grades to be manipulated after the fact. In other words, Idaho Freedom Foundation rates the bills and then the legislators determine their grades by how they choose to vote. That's an objective way to do it. He says any legislator complaining about one or several bill ratings tanking their score simply doesn't understand the Freedom Index. It would take dozens of wrong way votes to change a legislator's letter grade. One or two disputed votes isn't going to make a C- or D grade legislator. Mediocrity and failing grades indicate a pattern. And because the process is so robust, meaning hundreds of bills, minor disagreements fade into the background while the legislator grades take the spotlight. Now, again, not every legislator likes this, but again, it's a way of measuring, how closely are they voting with your values. And your values may be different than mine, so keep that in mind. Ron says it's worth noting that other groups publishing legislative scorecards are not nearly as comprehensive and forthright as the Idaho Freedom Foundation. These groups use standards tied to special interests. They provide no reasoning for their recommendations and or cherry pick a handful of bills after votes in order to judge legislators. None of them come close to analyzing and rating as many bills as the IFF. None of them publish their detailed metrics for all to see. In other words, those groups' systems are ripe for bias, manipulation, and inaccuracy. Now, the Freedom Index, he says, shows how the legislature has improved its conservative and freedom record. And this is the beauty of being able to look back over the last 13 years and see what has it done in terms of holding legislators accountable. He says, we've seen it improve its conservative and freedom record. We can see there are 29 all-star legislators this year who did well to hold the line. These were the ones who scored A and B grades. We can also see 38 other legislators in the so-called so-so D and C grades, leaving 38 cellar dwellers or grade F on the index who seem to work against the values of freedom and limited government. Now, by comparison, last year there were only 20 A and B graded legislators, 18 in the C and D grades, and 67 who scored an F. So the 2025 legislature improved by 9 higher grade earning legislators, 20 additional so-so legislators, and 29 fewer F legislators. Bottom line is the legislature is moving toward freedom, and that is good news, no matter how you slice it. Now, please understand, too, that the goal of the Freedom Index is not that, we need every legislator marching in lockstep and chanting in unison. It's good to have robust disagreement. But there have to be some areas where we need to come together. And this is where the Idaho Freedom Index really tries to give some objective metrics by which we can measure what are the things that work in the interest of everyone, not just, the favored few who may, want to bring in a special interest, the cattlemen or the building industry or whatever it may be. But to take another closer look at how the Idaho Freedom Index works for you, I'm going to lean on Brent Regan. Brent is he's on the board of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, but he calls it a powerful tool. And more importantly, it's a tool that you as a citizen and I as a citizen can pick up and use anytime that we want. We just have to care enough to want to use it and to try to use it to help understand how our legislators are voting. Brent frames this by saying, look, an Idaho legislative session may have more than 600 bills considered, with more than 300 actually passed into law. And historically, with that many bills, he says it was easy for legislators to return home after the session and tell their constituents about only the wonderful votes that they cast. But a comprehensive picture of that legislator's performance was nearly impossible to determine. And he says you might be surprised to learn that a dozen years ago, the most liberal progressive legislator wasn't a Democrat. She was a Republican from Sandpoint. And there seemed to be no tax hike, no regulation, no new agency or loss of liberty that she voted against. Yet her constituents believed she was a conservative Republican because that's what she told them she was. Okay, we've seen this actually all over the state. And he says it was situations like this that inspired the Freedom Index. And the concept is simple. Bills are rated against 14 freedom metrics in order to get a score. Now, these are simple metrics. They're posted on the Idaho Freedom Foundation's website, idahofreedom.org. The metrics ask questions about a bill. Does it create a new government agency? Does it raise taxes? Does it expand government power? Does it restrict public access to information? Does it promote the breakdown of the traditional family? And a bill receives a negative point for each yes and a positive point for each no. Then when a legislator votes for the bill, that score is added to their total. So point by point, a pattern starts to emerge for each legislator as they vote on each of hundreds of bills. And by the end of the session, Brent points out we have a very good idea of whether that legislator supports big government, higher taxes, more regulation, and less freedom, or wants smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation, and more freedom. But remember, it's up to them and their vote to determine the grade that they get. They can't game the system. Now, in the material world, he says we generally care about things that we measure. Why? Because we can measure them. We can determine a value. We can track the changes. We can track the trends. We make it easier to think about what's actually in front of us. People obsess about their weight because it's easy to measure every morning with the scale next to the bathroom sink. We consider the cost of gasoline because we measure that by the gallon. We think about crop yields because we measure them in bushels per acre. Well, the Freedom Index, he says, makes it easy to track the performance of our legislators. This makes their performance important. I mean, everyone wants a good score. So the legislators begin to really think about each bill before they vote. Over time, this has had a remarkable positive effect on our individual freedoms. Critics claim that the Idaho Freedom Index is too powerful. They say it influences the vote of legislators. But Brent says, no, that puts the cart before the horse. The bill scoring simply reflects the effect the bill will have if passed into law. Now, the legislators are free to vote however they want. They will carry the consequences of that vote with them. So the Freedom Index is transparency. It's a simple system that gives you and me a good general idea about how each legislator votes. Now, should it be the only factor when determining who gets your vote? Brent says, of course not. There are other factors, there are other indices. Due to the way the Freedom Index is conducted, though, he says it is the most comprehensive and also the most consistent measure of a politician's performance. It's the voters' trusty yardstick that helps them decide who should be sent to Boise next. And the world of politics, he points out, is flooded with special interests. There's a seemingly endless supply of petitioners looking for favors from government. In this sea of lobbyists, who's representing you? Who's looking out for your interests? Who? Well, the answer is it's the Idaho Freedom Foundation. That's an important one. If you take away nothing else from today's video, that's the one. Brent says the Idaho Freedom Foundation is looking out for you because through the Freedom Index, it gives you the information you need to decide which legislators or which representatives are more interested in protecting your freedom, your property, your wealth, your happiness. Legislators can campaign on all the rhetoric they want, but at the end of the day, how they vote, their actions are the only thing that truly matters. Knowing how they vote gives you the power to decide. So maybe you were on the fence. Maybe you were already, actually just grateful to have access to the Idaho Freedom Index. But if you were sitting on the fence and saying, I don't know if I see the value, hopefully I've given you some things to think about today, courtesy of Ron, Nate, and also Brent Regan, as to why you should pick up this tool and start putting it to work. Look, your freedom is at stake. Your pocketbook is at stake. Government should be working for you, not against you. So if you want to really know what your legislators are doing in that regard, well, it's a handy tool. Maybe you should consider picking it up and using it. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.